the record, this interview has been conducted at the Centre for Indigenous Education on the 4th of February 1999 under the auspices of the great Gary Foley. Murrandoo Yanner, welcome to Melbourne.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
Indeed. And welcome to the Centre for Indigenous Studies, which is a particular icon around Melbourne University, a place that's been hard fought for and will be fought for to keep it going. But you're doing the fight against Century Zinc. That seems to be your main preoccupation.
It is, brother, but it's just the main one because it's in the front yard. At the same time, it's as much a concern to me seeing this beautiful centre here under threat. So I got my full support there in whatever activities they get up in the future to preserve this, just as I know I got their full support in whatever activities we get up to in future to preserve our country.
What's the nub of the main fight of your people against Century Zinc? What is RTZ, the British mining company, doing that concerns you?
Anything and everything. We don't want to know them. We wish they'd go back to Britain or wherever the hell they came from. It's our country and it's Australia. It belongs to a few white fellas too nowadays, but it sure as hell don't belong to the Queen and the Bank of England, who are the biggest shareholders of RTZ. Our mob are the least exploited area in the whole of Australia in regards to mining. It's the least mined area and there's no mining there. That's what they mean by it. It's the first mine. And on the whole map of Australia, if you drew big circles, the least mined area is our area. So it's almost pristine. It is pristine. You catch big giant mud crabs just sticking your finger in the water. So we want to preserve that. We don't want any mining. And today it's become a big crime for people to think like that, particularly Aboriginal people. It's all right to say no to uranium mining, very popular, but to say no to mining in general sends white guys through the roof, and even some black people nowadays, particularly in ATSIC. Oh, we need jobs, we need economic this. Well, I think we need the country more. Surely if the 2,000 something mines around this country at the moment ain't creating jobs or bringing a better lifestyle to Australians, it's because the government and the people in charge are letting the companies have too much of their own way in regards to incentives and things, not keeping and preserving the wealth in this country. So I mean, one mine, no matter what they say, ain't going to make the difference up home to the national economy, so we don't want it. We don't want any mining at all. We like the way we live. We like the place without mines. Even though we're all unemployed and stuff, we're still Aboriginal and we've still got a beautiful country that in years to come will be priceless, even economically, priceless in terms of ecotourism. People are going, we have what people won't have in a few years and what people down on the East Coast don't have today. And many of them come up to our country just for holidays, all the way from Victoria, New South, right up into the scrub where I live. And I often ask them what they're there for, and it's the same thing. We can't find anything like this anywhere else. So I think that in its own, even by white Australian standards, they support us. It's just they allow themselves to be bullied into believing what the media tell them, that we're all dissidents and trying to stop the economy, etc. But I don't give a stuff about the economy because we don't play an active part in it, so I don't care if stopping mines wrecks the economy, because until we're an active partner in it, why should we be concerned about it?
Murrandoo, close your eyes and describe your country to me.
Well, it's beautiful, big, open, wide country, very flat. It's got the largest salt pan systems in the world, very harsh looking country at first when people get there, but you can find millions of different shells and clams in the creeks and that. A lot of turtle, dugong, barramundi, mud crabs, oysters. We get them all ourselves. Even though we're poor, we can eat $38 by the kilo red emperor and coral trout by the bucket loads, truck loads. Tons of bush tucker and stuff, just got to know how to find them. But it's bush savanna country, a little bit like Africa. Giant grass plains away from the ocean and towards the ocean, giant salt pans. And mostly a predominantly black region, black people as far as the eye can see. A bit like Eddie Murphy in the Boomerang picture and that. It's a lot of large Aboriginal communities, formerly reserves or concentration camps we call them, where people were herded or whipped or chained, shot into going into. But now they have a benefit because they turned into Aboriginal strongholds. We have places where no matter how dangerous, we're actually safe amongst our own mob. So that's like my region is beautiful for that. Everyone's connected, even if they're not in blood related. They've known each other, and their family has known each other since the beginning of time. Our great-great-great-grandparents before they came knew theirs, all of us today there. And no matter how much we shift around, most of us have been left within the region. So it's a very beautiful country.
What colours are the land and the sea and the sky?
The sky is a beautiful blue. It has the greatest orange-red sunsets and pink when cyclone come. A lot of cyclones in our country, and we know before the greatest technology on earth, the satellites and all that the cyclone's coming. By the activities of the ants and the brolgas, and in particular the only time we ever get perfect pink sunsets a couple of weeks before a cyclone comes, and white technology can only pick cyclones up as they're forming. We know before they form from signs like that, but it's mostly a greyish, yellowish throughout most of the year. Then in the wet it becomes a rich exotic green because we have a giant monsoon. But there's blue and red mountains and beautiful gorge like Kakadu, but the ocean is mostly blue and green and very pristine and crystal clear all around the islands off home, Aboriginal island people. And on the mainland there's a lot of big yellow grass plains which turn green in the wet, black soil plains. The soil up there is black, pretty fertile at times but a very rough clay. And the main colours really are the blue ocean and the blue sky with the orange sunset, greyish, yellowish bush and country in the dry, and exotic green in the wet, and the blue and green ocean and rivers.
And what does RTZ and Century Zinc Mine want to do with that land?
They want to create the biggest lead and zinc mine in the world, which in an area that has absolutely no mining is a horrific circumstance, for the fact that if you wanted to get blackfellas used to mining, which real blackfellas should never get used to because it's truly exploitative of the country, it fucks up the land, pardon my French, big time. And we, no matter how poor that up there, always survive off the land, no matter how bad the suicides, the death rates, the infant mortality. What little hope there is, what stops it from being a high infant mortality and a higher malnutrition rate, etc., is because of the land looking after us. And I believe people who are bad or evil to the land or support digging it up, when they're out bush and the car breaks down, they're looking for water, they're going to walk straight past the lagoon and be blind to it. Mother Nature pays them back. Where we break down or we're starving, things come to us, almost present themselves on a silver plate. And I believe that's purposeful, all energy and aura and karma, what goes around comes around. So they want to bring heavy shipping into the Gulf for the first time ever. We only got little fishermen boats there, and they're usually a bit, bit careful about the industry and polluting the water because they want to be sustainable. Even though they overfish the place, they are careful about pollution. But the miners are bringing in foreign ships for the first time ever into the lower Gulf, the middle of between Arnhem Land and Cape York, and we don't have anything there like that. Never ever seen an oil tanker in our lives, and we really don't want to, because they bring in foreign bacteria from different oceans. And I've noticed that lately that the thorny crownfish, which never ever existed on the Great Barrier Reef, which is along the east coast, a long way from us and across land, but it's gotten into the lower Gulf now. I was diving off Mornington for giant clams a couple of weeks ago and was shocked to see a bloody thorny crownfish. And things like that aren't there, that they want to create, that are far, the negative benefits of this mine and anything they can offer far outweigh the negative. We don't want them dumping ballast water with the foreign bacteria and the petrol and oil in it, and we just don't want big ships coming to dugongs, because we're all poor, we rely a lot on bush tucker. Dugongs and turtles in particular have very sensitive hearing. Dugongs only got a tiny little ear, like a 5-cent coin, a little slit, yet it can hear our boats with motors coming from miles away, and they often run, and we usually spot them spouting on the run. We never ever sneak up on them because of even a little outboard motor. So big ships like that with all their noise and thing, the dugong are all going to run back to Arnhem Land and Cape York, and our mob are going to starve because they're already on the lowest sort of income in this country up there, and they're all unemployed. So the only hope we got at the moment of surviving is through our bush tucker, and that's a great threat.
What's the state of play between the Carpentaria Lands Council and Century Zinc Mine? Where is the fight at the moment? I thought that an agreement had been reached some time ago, but that's not the case, is it?
An agreement had been reached with 14 people, some who had been bullied and intimidated and threatened into signing, some who'd been bribed or corrupted into signing. Some of them were good people. They were the ones who were bullied and intimidated and threatened and harassed, and basically all 14 signed under duress. All 14 had no right other than making a native title claim to actually speak on behalf of the wider community of the lower Gulf of Carpentaria. None of them were elected by the communities of the lower Gulf of Carpentaria to say, go and sign that document. So that means nothing to us, and no matter who signs what, the whole thing we're talking about in the first place is as relevant, regardless of a signature on paper. The Gulf of Carpentaria's environment is still under threat. The cultural survival of the indigenous people of that region, who are majority at the moment, is going to be under threat through the marginalisation of them overnight by massive mining numbers. So we just really don't want them there, and we're still fighting. We've never ever signed no document us. and we've never ever talked to the miners since. We've just talked to them through court or through physical action on the ground. We have a bridge that's integral to the project blocked, and we're negotiating and blocking a power line that is integral to the project. So while they were focusing on getting the mine up in the pipeline where most of our energies were focused, we did a deceptive move on them and picked the areas that were as important yet poorly secured by themselves, and we attacked those, and by the time they woke up we've done good so far. So the battle will continue. Even if they get their power line pipeline through, we simply lose that battle, but the war rages on. We have to move to a different circumstance where perhaps the pipeline and the power line, because there's still a threat to the region, need to be disabled or dismantled or sabotaged, and that's some people may consider that terrorism, etc. Terrorism is allowing people to be placed in an inhumane situation where all legal, political, social avenues, doors, opportunities that were open to them to address those issues have been slammed shut and locked in their face. So there's only one avenue left, and that is to empower themselves and don't hurt nobody, but certainly protect the environment and hurt that which would hurt it, because they're basically poisoning future generations of our children, and we're either dogs to sit by, and I don't want to watch that happen, because I don't want to explain to my grandkid why he can only hear about a turtle and a dugong, and they're as extinct as the brontosaurus in future. You know, I don't want to think. I want him to see the beauty and experience what I've experienced through my ancestors keeping that place pristine. So that's our custodial role, not traditional owners, traditional custodians. We don't own nothing to sign away. We're just meant to look after it so it's there forever. So we'll fight them till we drop dead. It's just moved into a different phase, and we've been forced. We will be forced in future to take action in our own hands and dismantle and sabotage machinery and pipelines and power lines. And it's a pity. It's a pity old people and young people and people like myself who are normally law-abiding have to be forced to do that to protect country, when that's the job of the National, Department of Environment and Heritage and all this crap. A bunch of bureaucrats being paid out of all us taxpayers' money, and they turn a blind eye to true destruction of the environment, what they're really there to protect. Instead it's all la-di-da-di bloody conferences and talk about the ozone layer, but things they can actually change and affect right now they don't have the courage to do. So it's left to little people like us, the rank and file, the masses, to do it ourselves.
Murrandoo, you've raised the question of the broader political struggle. You've not restricted yourself at all to just fighting for the people of Carpentaria and for the land of Carpentaria. You've been very essentially involved with the Jabiluka blockade for the Mirror people. You see that there is no border that you should be setting up and restricting yourself to a single fight. You see that Aboriginal fight for land around Australia is the same fight?
Exactly the same fight. Oppression knows no borders, so why should the fighters of oppression obey the rules of borders? If oppression goes across the border, then I follow it, any border. And I think that's likewise with the Jabiluka people and people here in Melbourne, the community, and that's been the situation long before I was born. I was born in the year of the 10 Embassy struggle, so that in itself symbolises, no one said to them, the Ngunnawal didn't say to people coming there, the traditional owners of Canberra, you've all gone across our border. It was the battleground there. So wherever the trouble spots are, I believe that's where Aboriginal people who may have a problem in their own community but don't have a rallying point, they go there to talk about their own things and address their own situation as much by sacrificing themselves for the greater good of the collective group, But yeah. Just where I've been to Jabiluka, I know it might offend the NLC, and they've got friends in ATSIC who can harass our land council and our funding over it. But if we don't stick up for them, who the hell is ever going to expect them to stick up for us? So it's in the collective interest. We're even being a little bit selfish. It's in our interest to support Jabiluka because Jabiluka will support us.
You mentioned the Tent Embassy. For the first time in many years, there's been moves by the government to review the Tent Embassy. I don't think they've actually come out and said they're prepared to demolish it yet, but it does seem to be a very important icon to Aboriginal people, the Tent Embassy on the lawns of Parliament, which has been there since 1972, as you say.
But yeah, I think it is an icon. It's I was born in that year. It was a national culmination. It wasn't the first. There were things going on since the 20s and 30s politically, but it was certainly a very important culmination. Canberra is an icon in itself for the national parliament, and therefore is a perfect place to set up ours in the land of the Ngunnawal. And so much struggle as people born before me and after went into creating that. And if it's under threat, I think that's half good for the fact that might have mobilised a lot of our people. And I mean, they can tear it down because they should know the history as well as us. They tore it down on many occasions. It got re-established. And no matter how many times they tear it down in the future, it will continue to be re-established because it's become too important an icon for everybody. People like me who were born in that year when it was happening and didn't know till later. There was a lot of spiritual energy in the Aboriginal nation at that stage. So there and since, a lot of people have come to look upon that as holy ground, the Mecca, the one trip we must make during our life. And that's what I said to my little son: one day you're going to go to Aboriginal Tent Embassy. It's nothing flash, but there's a lot of sacredness to that ground because of the mass gatherings and the aura and energy and the spirit combined in those mass gatherings. They're really powerful on that stuff, and that's the same in traditional bush stuff. The initiation grounds have had corroborees and initiations for thousands of years, the same ground. That's what makes them sacred. So many people's ancestors gone through there, so much stamping the grounds happened there, and energy's been built into the ground, aura and physical energy. So that's the same with the Canberra protest. And I mean, it's a resting place of Kevin Gilbert too, his ashes. So he was a very important Aboriginal leader, one of the most straightforward and serious, and had a good vision of a real treaty and real sovereignty rights. And we've never even come close, the Australian government or people, to recognising or addressing the issues he raised on behalf of our nation.
I'd just like to finish on the Australian federal government. What is your view of this government as compared to its predecessor governments, including the Whitlam and Fraser governments, when you're only a child, but I'm sure you've read about them? What is your view of the direction this government is taking on Aboriginal affairs? And what do you think will happen as the new millennium unfolds, starting with the Sydney Olympics? So let's go from the Howard government's attitude to Aborigines to what's going to happen. Probably
summed that up in one quote. The great Ronnie Millsap sang "Lost in the 50s" tonight. And I think John Howard's somewhere lost in the 50s. He seriously is. He's gone back to the White Australia policy. That's proven by the immigration thing on behalf of all Australia. You can see the people coming into this country immigrating, the ones being locked up and having to seek refugee status and go through all of the shameful way of doing things. They're given no respect or dignity as they come into the country. They're thrown into jails and things. They all run away from wars and famine and poverty. Those people are given the hardest time, yet over 230,000 South Africans, white South Africans, who have fled rather than stay in that country and make a go, but like a good few decent white South Africans are doing. These guys are the ex-security guys who are murdering people and amassing fortunes, just like the Nazi establishment during the Jewish genocide. They're allowed into the country. They're all over many of Pauline Hanson's strongholds in Queensland, where her members were elected in the state election. 10-1 Nation Party people were elected. They were all in areas. They were the areas that are most popular with South Africans. Out of all the states in Australia, Queensland and WA are the two #1 destinations for those South Africans. They're getting into the police force, security, privatising prisons, taking them over, and they're as vicious. They picked this place because it's their dream of what they couldn't create in Africa. And I think that says it all. The South African white racist security forces are proof in itself. They have picked this country out of every white nation on earth as the perfect utopia they could never create. They know, and that's how apartheid was created, from an actual official delegation of South African government people here in the 40s and 50s stealing the Queensland Act on Aboriginals, the Aboriginal Protection Act, to keep us in our place, and we had to go and have a permit to go and visit someone. We weren't allowed to drink and all those things. They actually stole all that because they couldn't find a better system on earth to oppress blacks and keep it in their place. So I think that in itself is a condemnation on this country, that basically a bunch of Nazi Gestapo war criminals would run to a place like this. What sort of country are we to, one, even allow them in while oppressing the poor, secondly to allow them in a dignified manner and to buy half the country up and take over the same sort of security and physical forces that are operating in South Africa. It really is a racist country, and any salvation from that racism comes from leadership, leading the nation away from it, and John Howard can't do that. He's taken us back to the dark ages, back to putting us under the Act, and making everyone work for the dole. That's another form of enslavement, yet continuing their taxes, but them seeing no benefit out of the taxes. So I think John Howard's definitely a racist. I often think he's an alien. He's that artificial. His eyebrows don't match, and he ums and ahs, and he can't sit down and have a debate one-on-one with any human being. He needs his advisors, and he needs a piece of paper. He's a very cold, inhumane person. He's been dehumanised, and he needs to be rehumanised, and only the masses can do that to him and others.
Murrandoo, problems of Aboriginal people may have lessened slightly over the last couple of decades. One of Gary Foley's great criticisms is that huge amounts of money have been funneled into what he calls the Aboriginal industry, which he says is predominantly a white-run industry. You yourself have got some fairly acerbic criticisms of ATSIC. What's wrong with ATSIC? Why are the problems still there? Why haven't they solved the problems? They've had hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, ATSIC was born from a faulty sperm to start with. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. An act written up by, I met the lawyer that wrote the ATSIC Act. He's an Indian bloke who works for the white oppressor here in Canberra, an Indian lawyer, and he wrote the act up, him and a couple of white guys, and the act basically was a repeat of DAA. While it allowed a lot more Indigenous people some form of entering in the government and getting experience, it's at the lower level. It's basically the ATSIC administration is the Commonwealth, and the blacks elected are simply a little local government level. One regional manager in the whole ATSIC region in any office in this country holds more power than the 20 elected councillors that we all get out of bed and make a big fuss and rush to go and vote in. And after all that, the one bloke that wasn't elected still runs the show, and that's because the Act allows that. The Act was written up in the first place wrongly. There were ADC commissioners who opposed it under Jerry Hann, and they were sacked. My father was one of them, by not giving the black rubber stamp to that. So they were sacked, those 7. That's the worst thing. All the whites around the country think we're actually living like oil sheiks or pissing money up against the wall, when in fact it's bureaucrats. 90% of it's all going to white business, white lawyers, anthros, arcos, because there ain't many black fellows who are lawyers, anthros, arcos at the moment. I run a land council with roughly $2 million a year funding from ATSIC, and I know for a fact that 90% of that funding, though I don't want to give it, has to go, because ATSIC conditions of spending don't allow you black fellas to build a house. You must have a white contractor, because not many of us are qualified. We can build houses, but we don't have the paper, so we can't pay them to do it. Got to go and get this guy, bring him in from outside. He doesn't employ anyone local. Got to use lawyers to run native title argument. Not allowed to get our own people up because of the way the Native Title Act's set up. The complementary Aboriginal Acts like the Native Title Act and ATSIC, they're complementary to each other. They keep this Aboriginal industry going. With a tiny minority of black fat cats, but the mass exploiting that dollars are non-Aboriginal people. I know when we run a native title claim, we're not allowed to pay. The native title claim starts with the black fella sitting here talking about his country, what country you want to claim that, yet he's not allowed to be paid a cent. Yet the lawyers get 500, 800 a day, the anthros, the arcos, the consultants, the QCs, right up the system. And that's ridiculous. And that is where all the money's going. And no doubt if that's happened in my lifetime since 91 to today, I can imagine what's happened in the last 30, 40 years to the great majority of Aboriginal money given to our people. And as to whether it's getting any better since the last 40 years, maybe on one angle it is. But then again, 40 years ago, Redfern, or 30, 20 years ago, Redfern was nowhere like it is today. So has it got better? I don't think so. I mean, people would say without a doubt that 10, 20 years ago, Redfern was 10 times better. So I think in a lot of ways, more ways, it's gotten worse than it's gotten better. And that's what we've got to recognise. People have looked at and promoted the tiny bit of positive things that have happened and really left out and hide and suppress from general public's knowledge the things like are happening in Redfern and out at Doomadgee. The suicide rates, the overdose, the fact that we thought alcoholism was a problem, while heroin and stuff with needles is a bloody nightmare. So it's, sure, it's all right for some people sitting in their surreal world, just watching, to them Aboriginals and reconciliation, everything is something they can write in and support or just watch on TV and talk about. But to actually get out and about in this country, I'd say things haven't changed. They become more covert and clever. They use a Black Land Council to oppress the people of Jabiluka and force them to have a mine where before they'd just come in and do it. So has it got any better? Is Jabiluka any different than Nukunba? I don't think so. So if anything, it's worse. They've turned publicly and resourced one big group of Indigenous people who are getting resourced falsely, meant to be there for the people. They've resourced them to oppress the people. So basically the Jackies, the black trackers, the red the troopers, gone off the horse in the blue coats to living in motels, working for ATSIC and driving BMWs. I mean, it's just he no longer has to have a horse and stuff. They're really flash nowadays.
All right, let's assume you've got all the money in the world you're ever going to need. What do you do to clean up the health problems, the drug problems, the poverty problems, the sickness problems, the health problems?
Well, a lot of that comes from living in poverty. If you can uplift people's living standard, if you can ensure that when they go to hospital with a cancerous brain tumour, they're not going to be looking at a nurse behind an iron concrete sheet and nervously passed a Panadol and told to go home without being looked at. They're actually going to have 3 of the best doctors that could look at brain tumour actually treating them, even though they're just a little black fellow off the street. I think that could make a big difference, actually save lives, actually lift people out of the thing where they have a choice, that they don't have to turn to alcohol to escapism, don't have to turn to drugs because things ain't so bad. And I think if you can change things from being so bad in terms of the living conditions, then the negative results, suicide, drugs, etc., that come out of those bad circumstances, they'll naturally change themselves anyway. But I think there's enough wealth in this country and there's enough people to share that wealth, providing we stand up and reclaim the country. And seriously, it's gone to the bloody down the drain. It's gone to the multinationals. They're just totally exploiting it through mineral exploitation, through the pastoral leases they're buying up, etc., through the Japanese, American, British interests buying up half of the Gold Coast, etc. One day everyone's going to wake up refugees in their own country like Indigenous people have been for 200 years.
So in short, the solution is to end the poverty, grant land rights and provide funding.
And certainly change the racism in this country, because that's what starts all problems. Gain some respect, not just for Indigenous people. Before you can respect an Indigenous person as a human being, you need to rehumanise yourself, because the history of this country has dehumanised every single descendant of white Australians that originally came here. They've been dehumanised by the actions of their ancestors. They say, oh, that was my ancestors did that, I don't have to do nothing. Well, that's cool. That means you're at a low scale on the scale of humanity. You're willing to turn a blind eye to the genocide and say, I have no responsibility for that, for the dehumanising actions of my ancestors. But if you want your kids to one day be proud of your ancestors, then you're going to have to start at your level, because their ancestors above white Australians now have nothing to be proud of. So this may be the generation heading in the year 2000 that can actually say to their kids in a couple of generations, I stood up and I was counted and we changed this country for the better. We did what some bunch of gutless bastards should have done 211 years ago. Treated Indigenous people as equals with respect and listened to them and respected and loved their difference to us. I don't want to be a white fella and work and get a house and car. I want people to love and respect me as a bloke chasing goannas and sharing and pissing money up against the wall by giving it all away to rallies and that, which white fellas don't do, but that's part of me and that's what I am, and I can accept white people as they are, providing they can do it with us.
Murrandoo, thank you very, very much for an extensive political discourse about Australia. I'd like to end with just a few personal questions so that people have some idea of who you are and where you've come from. You have an extremely well-developed sense of political activism. You're 26, turning 27 this year, but you speak as if you've been a politician for 20 years. When were you first touched by politics? When did you first know that you were going to have to work for your people?
From the moment my mum and dad conceived me, I guess, because I was born from a strong man and from the genes of a strong man and woman. My dad was a grassroots activist and a tough man, both physically and mentally, in our region. He was from the region down there, traditionally from there, and my mum was stolen generation, quite on the opposite scale, didn't know where I'd come from, where she belonged. So I was born from the two different sides, both full of pain and oppression, a lot of spirit in the conception, I guess. So even before I learnt to think for myself, I guess I was born into that, but certainly the education system and society helped suppress that in me for a long time. And I don't know, the real incident, I guess, was the death of my father, in that I realised that his life's work was really for my benefit, not for his, because he chose not to go away to big jobs that were offered to him. He was as deadly or more deadly than myself, and he was offered a lot of jobs and a good car and another place, and he refused to move away from the community, and he lived on a lower wage just to stay in the community, address the issues, not because he particularly liked that lifestyle, but he was the only one there who could do it or was doing it. So it was important, that role, to uplift our people. So I guess I'm picking up the banner when he fell on the battlefield, and that's a little way I make my own worship to him every day, by carrying out his life's work, which is, I realise now by doing it, that it's not for me. I'm hardly going to... I've since seen a lot of stuff he didn't get to see before he died, and I know likewise with my children, if I struggle hard for the next 20 years, they will see a benefit, and I'll make life better for them than it was for me.
Where did you meet our own great warrior Gary Foley? When was your first interaction with Gary?
Well, that's a funny story. When I was a kid and out bush, a young fella, 9 or 10, my dad, having gone down south a lot, coming back very politicised himself and going through massive changes that I noticed and all my brothers and sisters noticed, because you know, you grew up with him, he's in the house, he goes down to Brisbane, he comes around talking that and telling us yarns and really opening our minds up. Or he didn't necessarily have to do that just by other people around town, adults in the house, and we'd sit and listen, be around it. This cassette one day called Rebel Voices, got Aboriginal warrior with a band and a spear there, Red Sunset, and he on this thing it had, amongst other things, Les Collins with No More Boomerang, No More Spear, and that had Gary Foley in The Clash. And I was listening to all these songs and it was my favourite tape, and I heard this little black fella. 200 years ago, a bloke called Captain Cook came here, and the voice grabbed me and captivated me as if I knew that voice was a part of me, or for thousands of years. It was just a powerful moment, and even though he never sang, he didn't sing at all. It was only actually on the whole cassette, it was the only thing that wasn't a song. There were the Clash playing the music in the background, but he was speaking heavy and politically, and it was his voice. It grabbed not my ears, it grabbed my spirit and played with it. And from that day on, I'd never ever forgotten that voice. I didn't even know who the hell he was. I thought he was an Aboriginal singer, and I thought Clash was a black band when I was listening to his tape, but I knew he was a bloody hard political Murray. It's just I didn't know, because you know, educated in the bad white system out bush and isolated out bush, didn't know all these things were happening down here, and that there are strong Aboriginal leaders like that, because my people are very pacified because of the violence only being fresh there, colonisation, so often they tolerate stuff that they should not tolerate. And growing up in that, I was a little bit like that, despite having a balance of my father being strong to combat it. But then I met him in Townsville. I was talking to black uni students from around the country, and Gaz came down there as a black uni student from around the country, and after I'd finished speaking at the podium and people clapped and stuff, he got up and he said, we've been following you for a little while, brother, and I'd just like to say from our little mob in Victoria, he never introduced himself, he just got up and said, I'd like to give you a big hello, and you know you got our support. And I knew the moment he opened his mouth, that voice came back to me from the cassette when I was a kid. So I said, thank you very much, brother Gary, you've been a great role model and hero to me too, you know, as a kid, because I knew that voice. He didn't have to introduce himself. I'd never seen him in my life, never saw a photo, but the moment he opened his mouth, that voice had made that big an impact on me as a kid. And that voice was 20 years older than it is today, 20 years younger back then than it is today. But it was that was a powerful moment.